The Haunting of Black Pine Woods. It was supposed to be a night of healing, a chance for Annie and her family to find solace amidst their grief. Her mother had passed away 3 months ago, and the wounds were still fresh. So when Annie's brother Sam suggested a camping trip to Black Pine Woods, a place they used to visit as kids, everyone agreed. It felt like the perfect way to reconnect with each other, and in some way, with their mother's memory. The woods were dense and ancient, the towering pines swaying against the night sky. Their campsite was secluded, nestled near a clearing where the moonlight cast an eerie silver glow. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Annie sat by the crackling fire, clutching her mother's locket. Inside was a small photograph of her as a child, held in her mother's arms. "She always loved this place," Annie murmured to Sam. He nodded, his face shadowed by the flickering flames. "It's strange," Sam said after a moment. "Mom never talked about why she stopped coming here." Annie shrugged. Their mother had always been enigmatic, with a past she kept tightly locked away. As the firelight danced, the conversation shifted to lighter topics, but Annie couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was off. The air felt colder than it should have been for late summer, and every now and then she thought she saw movement in the trees. When everyone retired to their tents, Annie remained awake, staring at the embers of the dying fire. She felt restless, like that the forest itself was alive and watching her. That's when she heard it, a faint whisper, so soft it could have been the wind. "Annie." Her heart jumped. She stood and looked around. "Sam? Claire? Is that you?" she called, her voice trembling. No one answered. She stepped closer to the edge of the woods, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Annie?" It was unmistakably her mother's voice. Her blood ran cold, but she couldn't stop herself from following the sound. She ventured deeper into the forest, the light of the campsite disappearing behind her. The whispers grew more insistent, leading her to a clearing she didn't recognize. In the center of the clearing stood a massive, gnarled tree. Its twisted roots jutted out like skeletal fingers, and the air around it was unnaturally still. Annie approached cautiously, and as she got closer, she noticed something carved into the bark, a name. Margaret Hawthorne. Her mother's name. Her pulse quickened. She reached out to touch the engraving when she heard a rustling behind her. Spinning around, she aimed her flashlight, but there was nothing there. "Annie." The voice was right behind her now. She whipped back around, and her flashlight fell to the ground. Standing before her was a shadowy figure, its features obscured but its presence undeniably familiar. "Mom?" Annie whispered, her voice breaking. The figure didn't respond, but its form flickered, and for a brief moment, Annie saw her mother's face, gaunt, pale, and filled with sorrow. "You shouldn't be here," the figure said, its voice layered with something deeper, darker. "What do you mean?" Annie stammered. Before she could get an answer, the figure vanished, and a wave of cold air rushed through the clearing. Annie stumbled back, gasping. That's when she noticed the ground beneath the tree was disturbed, like something had been buried there recently. Her heart pounded as she grabbed a stick and began digging, her hands trembling. After a few minutes, she unearthed a small, rusted box. Inside was an old photograph and a letter. The photograph showed her mother as a young girl, standing with a group of people Annie didn't recognize. But what caught her attention was the shadowy figure in the background, a figure that looked exactly like the one she had just seen. The letter was addressed to her mother. "Margaret, you cannot escape what binds us. The bloodline will always call you back. You know the truth, and you know the cost. Protect your children, or they will suffer the same fate." Annie's hands shook as she folded the letter. A sharp snap of a branch made her look up. The shadowy figure was back, but now it wasn't alone. Dozens of spectral forms emerged from the woods, their hollow eyes fixed on her. She turned and ran, the voices of the apparitions rising in a deafening chorus. "Annie? Annie." She reached the campsite, breathless and frantic. Sam and Claire emerged from their tents, startled by her panic. "What happened?" Sam asked, grabbing her shoulders. Before she could answer, the shadows arrived, encircling the campsite. The fire roared to life, casting wild shadows on the trees. "They're here," Annie gasped. "We have to go." But it was too late. The shadowy figures closed in, and the air grew thick with whispers and cold. One of them stepped forward, its form solidifying into the figure of their mother. Mom? Sam said, his voice breaking. Leave this place, the figure said, her tone desperate. The Hawthorne bloodline is cursed. You were never meant to return. The specters surged forward, and the siblings huddled together, bracing for the end. But just as the shadows reached them, the locket around Annie's neck began to glow. A blinding light erupted from it, forcing the apparitions back. When the light faded, the shadows were gone, and the forest was silent once more. Annie collapsed to the ground, clutching the locket. She understood now. Her mother had been protecting them from a dark legacy, one tied to the cursed bloodline of the Hawthorns. As dawn broke, they packed up and left Black Pine Woods, vowing never to return. But even as they drove away, Annie couldn't shake the feeling that the forest and the shadows were still watching. And she knew the curse wasn't over. The shadows of Crystal Pines Lodge. The chill of winter settled over the Crystal Pines Lodge, a sprawling wooden hotel perched high in the mountains. Snow blanketed the surrounding forest, muffling all sound except for the occasional groan of the wind. Jack Torrance stood at the window, gazing at the frozen landscape as twilight faded into night. The world seemed so still, yet Jack felt a restlessness that wouldn't let him be. He had taken the job as winter caretaker to give himself time to work on his novel, to rebuild his life after a string of failures. His wife, Wendy, and their 5-year-old son, Danny, had joined him, seeing it as an opportunity for family bonding. But as the days turned into weeks, an oppressive sense of isolation began to settle over them. It started subtly, small things that Wendy dismissed as the quirks of an old building. The lights flickered even when there was no storm. Doors creaked open on their own. Jack, who had thrown himself into his writing, brushed off Wendy's concerns. It's just the wind, he'd say. Danny, however, knew better. The boy had always been sensitive, prone to vivid dreams and an unsettling intuition that Wendy called his shine. At first, he didn't tell his parents about the whispers he heard late at night or the shadows that seemed to move in the corners of his vision. But one evening, as Wendy tucked him into bed, he clutched her arm. "Mommy," he whispered, his eyes wide with fear. "They don't like us here." Wendy's heart sank. "Who, sweetheart?" "The ones who live here, the ones you can't see." The next day, Jack decided they needed a break from the monotony. "Let's camp out in the West Wing tonight," he suggested. That part of the lodge, with its grand ballroom and sunlit atrium, had been closed off for the winter. It seemed like a perfect way to explore more of the building while doing something fun as a family. They packed sleeping bags and snacks and made their way through the empty halls. The West Wing was colder than the rest of the lodge, the air damp and heavy. They set up near the fireplace in the ballroom, the vast room echoing with their laughter as they roasted marshmallows over a portable stove. But as the night deepened, the laughter faded. Danny was the first to notice the change. He stared at the far corner of the room, his face pale. "What's wrong, Danny?" Wendy asked, following his gaze. "There's a man," Danny whispered. "He's watching us." Wendy's blood turned cold. She looked but saw nothing. "There's no one there, Danny. You're just tired." Jack laughed nervously. "Let's not spook ourselves. It's just shadows." But Danny shook his head, his voice trembling. "He's angry." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Wendy wrapped her arms around Danny, trying to comfort him, but her own unease was growing. Jack, determined to keep the mood light, threw more wood into the fireplace. That's when they heard it, a low, guttural laugh that echoed through the ballroom. Wendy froze. "Jack, please tell me that was you." Jack shook his head, his face pale. "It's just the wind," he stammered, but his voice lacked conviction. The laughter came again, louder this time, followed by the sound of footsteps. They echoed from the hallway leading to the atrium. Jack grabbed a flashlight and stood, his jaw set. "Stay here," he said. "Jack, don't," Wendy began, but he was already moving toward the sound. The hallway stretched before him, the beam of his flashlight flickering as if the batteries were dying. The footsteps continued, steady and deliberate, leading him deeper into the West Wing. "Who's there?" Jack called, his voice bouncing off the walls. No answer. He reached the atrium, its glass ceiling frosted over, allowing only faint moonlight to filter through. The room was empty, but Jack felt an overwhelming sense of being watched. He turned slowly, his flashlight catching glimpses of old furniture shrouded in white sheets. Then he saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the room. It was a man in a black suit, his face obscured by shadows. "Who are you?" Jack demanded, his voice shaking. The figure didn't move, but the air grew colder, and Jack felt a pressure in his chest, as if invisible hands were gripping his lungs. Back in the ballroom, Wendy clutched Danny, her eyes darting around the room. The shadows on the walls seemed to stretch and twist, forming shapes that didn't belong. The laughter returned, louder and more menacing. "Mommy," Danny whispered, tears streaming down his face. "They're coming." Wendy's instincts kicked in. She grabbed Danny and their things, like dragging him toward the hallway to find Jack. But as they reached the door, it slammed shut with a deafening bang. "Jack!" Wendy screamed, pounding on the door. Inside the atrium, Jack stumbled backward as the figure began to move toward him. Its footsteps echoed, slow and deliberate. The flashlight flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. "Jack!" A voice hissed, low and malevolent. "You belong to us now." Jack felt something cold brush against his arm, and he bolted, running back toward the ballroom. He slammed to the door just as Wendy managed to force it open. "We need to leave," she cried, her voice panicked. Together, they ran through the lodge, the whispers and laughter following them. Shadows danced on the walls, growing larger and more distorted with every step. They burst into their quarters, slamming the door behind them. Jack pushed a heavy dresser in front of it, his breath ragged. "What's happening?" Wendy demanded, clutching Danny. Jack didn't answer. He sank into a chair, his head in his hands. Danny, still trembling, looked up at his parents. "The lodge doesn't want us to leave," he said. Wendy knelt beside him. "What do you mean, Danny?" "They've been here a long time," he said. "They were waiting for us. Waiting for Daddy." Jack's head snapped up. "What are you talking about?" Danny's eyes filled with tears. "They say you're like them, that you belong to them now." A sudden bang on the door made them all jump. The dresser shook as if something was trying to force its way in. Jack stood, his face a mask of determination. "We're leaving. Now." They grabbed what they could and made their way to the main door of the lodge. The walls seemed to close in around them, the whispers growing deafening. As they stepped outside into the freezing night, the wind howled, carrying the faint sound of laughter. They didn't stop running until they reached their car. As Jack started the engine, Wendy glanced back at the lodge. In one of the top windows, she saw a figure watching them, a man in a black suit, his face hidden in shadows. They drove down the winding mountain road, the lodge disappearing into the darkness. But the feeling of being watched never left them. And Jack couldn't shake the words that had echoed in his mind in the atrium. "You belong to us now." The shadows beneath the pines. The air was thick with humidity, the kind that clung to your skin and made it hard to breathe. A group of college friends, Tina, Eric, Marcus, and Sophie, piled out of their rusted van, unloading sleeping bags and coolers into the clearing. They had come to camp in the remote backwoods of Texas, looking for an escape from the stress of finals. The pine forest stretched endlessly around them, its tall trees casting long, skeletal shadows in the fading light. "Think this is the right spot?" Tina asked, brushing her auburn hair out of her eyes as she glanced nervously at the thick underbrush. Eric shrugged, his usual confidence faltering. "According to the map, yeah. Crystal Creek should be just over that ridge." Marcus grinned and slapped Eric on the back. "Don't worry, man. We'll be fine. What's the worst that could happen? Bears? Coyotes? Bigfoot?" "Not funny," Sophie muttered, adjusting her backpack. By the time they had set up camp, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the forest seemed to come alive with sounds. The rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, and the occasional snap of a twig. They lit a fire and passed around marshmallows, their laughter echoing into the night. As the fire crackled, Marcus pulled out his phone and began to record. "All right, campers, welcome to Marcus's vlog of doom. Tonight's feature, 4 idiots in the middle of nowhere. Stay tuned for ghost stories and possible dismemberment." "Knock it off," Sophie said, swatting at him. "I'm serious," Marcus insisted, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "They say this area used to belong to some crazy family, the Slaughters or something like that. Real messed up people." "Slaughters?" Tina scoffed. "That sounds made up." Eric leaned closer to the fire. "It's not. My uncle told me about it once. He said they were killers, cannibals. They'd lure people into their house and, well, you get the idea." Tina rolled her eyes. "Right. And now their ghosts are going to come eat us. Give me a break." But Sophie didn't laugh. She glanced over her shoulder, her unease growing. "Can we not talk about this? It's creepy enough out here already." The conversation drifted to lighter topics, but the mood had shifted. One by one, they retreated to their tents, leaving the fire to smolder into embers. Tina was the last to crawl into her tent. As she zipped it shut, she noticed how quiet the forest had become. The chirping of crickets had ceased, leaving an oppressive silence. She shivered and pulled her sleeping bag tighter around her. Then she heard it, a faint scraping sound, like metal against stone. She sat up, her heart pounding. "Eric?" she called softly. "Marcus? Sophie?" No response. The sound came again, closer this time. It was deliberate, methodical. Tina held her breath, her eyes darting to the zipper of her tent. Shadows danced on the fabric as something passed by. Summoning her courage, she unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The campfire had died completely, leaving the clearing bathed in moonlight. She saw nothing at first, just the empty tents and the darkened trees. Then she saw movement near the edge of the clearing. A figure stood there, half hidden among the trees. It was tall and broad-shouldered, its face obscured by a strange, lumpy mask. In one hand it held a chainsaw, the blade glinting faintly in the moonlight. Tina's blood turned to ice. She ducked back into the tent and fumbled for her phone, her shaking hands struggling to unlock it. The scraping sound grew louder, accompanied by the faint rumble of the chainsaw's engine as it sputtered to life. "Tina?" a voice whispered. She nearly screamed but realized it was Sophie. Her friend's pale face appeared at the flap of the tent. "Something's out there," Sophie hissed, her voice trembling. "I saw it," Tina whispered back. Before they could move, the chainsaw roared to life, splitting the night with its deafening growl. The sound was joined by a scream, Eric's scream. The two girls bolted from the tent, their fear overriding any sense of direction. They found Marcus near the van, his face a mask of terror. "Eric, he's..." Marcus stammered, unable to finish. The chainsaw revved again, and they saw the masked figure step into the clearing. The man, if it was a man, moved with a deliberate, menacing grace, his weapon raised. "Run!" Tina shouted. They tore into the forest, branches clawing at their skin as they ran blindly through the dark. The sound of the chainsaw pursued them, accompanied by heavy, thudding footsteps. Marcus tripped and fell, landing hard on the ground. Tina and Sophie stopped, but before they could help him, the figure loomed over Marcus, raising the chainsaw high. "No!" Sophie screamed, but it was too late. They ran again, tears streaming down their faces. The chainsaw's roar faded, but the forest seemed endless, the trees closing in around them. Finally, they stumbled into a clearing and collapsed, gasping for air. "Is he gone?" Sophie whispered. Tina shook her head, her ears straining for any sound. The silence was suffocating. Then, from the shadows, a low, guttural laugh echoed. The figure emerged from the darkness, the chainsaw idling in his hands. Blood dripped from the blade, staining the pristine snow beneath his feet. Tina and Sophie clung to each other, their minds racing for a way out. As the figure stepped closer, Tina spotted something in the distance, a faint glimmer of light. "Over there!" she shouted, pulling Sophie to her feet. They sprinted toward the light, their legs burning with exhaustion. The chainsaw roared behind them, the figure giving chase. They burst into a small cabin, slamming the door shut behind them. Inside, the light came from an old oil lamp, its flickering flame casting eerie shadows on the walls. "Do you think we lost him?" Sophie asked, her voice barely audible. A loud crash answered her as the chainsaw tore through the door. The two girls screamed and backed into a corner as the door splintered and fell. The masked figure stepped inside, his eyes glinting with malice. Just as he raised the chainsaw, a gunshot rang out. The figure stumbled, dropping the chainsaw as blood blossomed on his chest. A man stepped out of the shadows holding an old hunting rifle. "You girls okay?" he asked, his grizzled face grim. Tina and Sophie nodded, too shaken to speak. "Come on," the man said. "This ain't the first time he's come around here. Won't be the last either. Let's get you somewhere safe." They followed him into the night, dusk leaving the cabin and the nightmare behind. But as they walked, Tina couldn't shake the feeling that they were still being watched. And in the shadows of the forest, the faint sound of a chainsaw echoed once more. The last campfire. The night air was cool, the only light coming from a flickering campfire. Tessa Harper adjusted her recorder, making sure it was picking up the crackle of flames and the distant calls of owls. She had been chasing this story for months. A cursed videotape that killed anyone who watched it exactly 1 week later. Urban legend? Maybe. But Tessa had seen enough strange cases to know there was often a shred of truth behind every tall tale. Her investigation had led her deep into the forest outside of Millhaven, where rumors said the tape had first surfaced. 3 friends had reportedly camped here before dying under mysterious circumstances. Local police had dismissed it as a tragic accident, a carbon monoxide leak in a faulty cabin, but locals whispered about the tape. Tessa wasn't one to let a chilling story go uninvestigated. She was alone, save for her equipment and her dog, Max, who lay curled up beside her tent. The small TV and VCR she had lugged out here were positioned near the fire. In her bag was a tape unmarked that she had received anonymously a week ago. Tessa glanced at her watch, 11:45 p.m. 7 days had passed since she watched the tape. Its strange images, static, shadowy figures, and a haunting woman with stringy black hair had played on her mind ever since. She told herself she didn't believe in curses, but doubt lingered in the pit of her stomach. "All right," she muttered, flipping open her notebook. "Time to document." She hit record on her camera, pointing it at herself. Day 7. I've been investigating the cursed videotape that allegedly causes death 1 week after viewing. No physical symptoms so far. No nightmares. Max suddenly perked up, his ears twitching. He let out a low growl, staring into the dark woods beyond the firelight. "What is it, boy?" Tessa asked, her heart skipping a beat. She turned off the camera and strained to listen. The forest had gone unnervingly quiet. No crickets, no wind rustling the trees, just silence. Then came the static. It started as a faint hiss, but quickly grew louder. Tessa spun around and saw the TV had turned on by itself. White noise filled the screen, and her stomach sank. "Damn it," she whispered, stepping cautiously toward the TV. She bent to switch it off, but before she could touch the dial, the static cut to a new image. It was the forest. This forest. The grainy footage showed trees identical to the ones surrounding her. The camera seemed to move deeper into the woods as if someone was walking with it, the lens bobbing slightly. Tessa's breath hitched. The screen flickered and a figure appeared. It was a woman, her face obscured by matted black hair. She wore a tattered white dress that seemed to float around her. The camera zoomed in on her face, but she didn't move. Tessa staggered back, her pulse racing. She reached for the power button, but the screen went black before she touched it. "Max," she called, her voice trembling. Her dog was gone. The leash lay empty on the ground. Panic bubbled in her chest as she grabbed her flashlight and scanned the surrounding woods. "Max! Come here, boy!" The beam of light cut through the trees, revealing nothing but shadows. Then she heard it, a faint, wet, gurgling sound, like someone choking. "Max!" The sound grew louder, echoing through the trees. She spun around, her flashlight darting from one spot to another, but the forest felt infinite, suffocating. Suddenly, the fire flared up, blazing so brightly that she shielded her eyes. When the light dimmed, she saw her TV had turned back on. The screen showed the clearing again, but this time it wasn't empty. She was there. Her own image stared back at her, standing by the fire with the flashlight in her hand. The version of herself on the screen turned, as if looking at something over her shoulder. Tessa froze. Slowly, she glanced behind her. Nothing. When she looked back at the screen, the woman in the white dress was standing directly behind her doppelganger. A piercing scream ripped through the night, and the screen went black. Tessa stumbled backward, tripping over her bag. The gurgling sound returned, louder now, and seemed to come from every direction. She scrambled to her feet, breathing heavily, and bolted into the forest. The flashlight's beam jittered as she ran, the trees blurring together. She didn't know where she was going, only that she needed to get away. The gurgling followed her, growing closer and closer. "Tessa." The voice was low, raspy, and inhuman. She spun around, shining her light wildly. "Who's there?" The light caught a glimpse of white fabric, and then it flickered out. Darkness swallowed her. Tessa fumbled with the flashlight, smacking it against her palm. When it came back on, the woman was there, just inches away. Her hair parted, revealing a pale, bloated face with hollow black eyes. Her mouth twisted into an unnatural grin, and water dripped from her cracked lips. Tessa screamed, stumbling back. The woman reached out with skeletal fingers, her nails black and jagged. No! Stay away! Tessa shouted, swinging the flashlight wildly. The woman's grin widened as she lunged. The next morning, a group of hikers stumbled upon the campsite. The fire had long since burned out, leaving only cold ashes. The TV sat silent, its screen cracked. They found Tessa's recorder lying in the dirt. When they played it, the audio was warped, filled with static and faint whispers. Of Tessa, there was no sign. But deep in the forest, where the trees grew thick and the shadows lingered, a faint voice could be heard at night. 7 days. Return. The forest loomed dark and silent, the thin crescent moon casting faint silver light over the campsite. 5 friends sat around a crackling fire, their laughter echoing faintly through the trees. The trip had been Claire's idea, a chance to escape the pressures of college and work, but beneath the camaraderie there was unease. The campsite wasn't just any patch of woods. It was near the infamous Woodward Sanitarium, a place shrouded in local legend. Years ago, the sanitarium had housed Michael Yates, a man notorious for brutally killing his sister on Halloween night when they were children. He had escaped one foggy night, leaving behind a trail of carnage, only to vanish without a trace. "Come on, Claire, tell us a real ghost story," said Eric, poking at the fire with a stick. Claire smirked, her face shadowed by the flames. "All right, but don't blame me if you can't sleep tonight." She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "They say Michael Yates didn't just vanish. He's still out there, wandering these woods. The sanitarium's ruins are just a few miles from here. Some believe he never left and that he's waiting." "Waiting for what?" asked Sarah, pulling her jacket tighter against the chill. "For another Halloween," Claire said. "Another reason to kill." Eric rolled his eyes. "Please, that story's ancient. Yates would be, 50 now? Probably dead or rotting in some prison cell." "Maybe," Claire said with a shrug, "but people still go missing around here. Hikers, campers, they find their tents, their gear, but never their bodies." The group fell silent, the fire crackling louder in the stillness. Then Matt laughed nervously. "Nice try, Claire, you almost had me." But Claire wasn't smiling. Later that night, as the others drifted off to sleep, Claire lay awake in her tent, staring at the nylon ceiling. The wind rustled the leaves outside, and an owl hooted in the distance. Something about this place felt wrong. The silence was too deep, the darkness too thick. She rolled onto her side, trying to shake the unease. Then she heard it. A faint rustling outside her tent, followed by the crunch of leaves. Her breath caught. "Eric?" she whispered, thinking he might be pulling one of his usual pranks. No answer. She unzipped her tent slowly, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the empty campsite. The fire had died down to glowing embers. "Hello?" she called softly. The wind picked up, carrying a faint metallic scent, like rusted iron. Blood. She ducked back into her tent, zipping it shut. She told herself it was her imagination, that she was letting her own story get to her. But then she heard it again, slow, deliberate footsteps circling the campsite. In the neighboring tent, Sarah stirred, waking to the sound of distant movement. She sat up, rubbing her eyes, and listened. The wind? No, it was something heavier. A branch snapped, and her heart jumped. "Matt," she whispered, nudging him. Matt groaned, turning over. "What? Do you hear that?" He sat up, listening. The footsteps were closer now, heavy and uneven, like someone dragging a limp leg. "Probably a deer," Matt muttered, but even he didn't sound convinced. Sarah unzipped the tent slightly, peering out. The campsite was empty, the fire a faint glow. But then she saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the trees, barely visible in the moonlight. "Matt," she whispered, her voice trembling. The figure stepped closer into the faint light of the fire. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing ragged, blood-stained overalls. His face was obscured by a cracked white mask. Who is that?" Sarah stammered, pulling back into the tent. Matt grabbed the flashlight, fumbling with the switch. The beam flicked on just as the man reached their tent. A large, rusted knife glinted in his hand. The scream woke Claire instantly. She bolted upright, grabbing her flashlight and stumbling out of her tent. Across the campsite, Matt and Sarah's tent was in shreds, blood soaking the ground. "Sarah! Matt!" Claire screamed, but there was no response. Eric and Jenna emerged from their tent, their faces pale. "What's happening?" Jenna asked, her voice shaking. Before Claire could answer, a low, guttural growl came from the shadows. They all turned, the flashlight beams trembling as they swept the trees. "Run," Claire whispered. The three of them sprinted into the woods, the flashlight beams bobbing wildly. The footsteps followed, heavy and relentless. Eric tripped over a root, landing hard on his hands and knees. "Go," he shouted, as Claire and Jenna hesitated. A shadow fell over him. The masked man raised his knife, and Claire turned away, Jenna pulling her deeper into the forest as Eric's scream pierced the night. They ran until their lungs burned, finally collapsing in a small clearing. Jenna was sobbing, clutching Claire's arm. "We have to keep moving," Claire said, though her own voice was unsteady. Jenna shook her head. "We'll never make it. He'll find us." Claire scanned the clearing, her flashlight catching glimpses of the surrounding trees. Then she saw it, a crumbling structure hidden by vines and moss. "The sanitarium," she whispered. They stumbled toward it, pushing through the rusted gates and into the darkness. The air inside was damp and cold, the smell of mildew and decay overwhelming. Claire led the way, her flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The building was a maze of collapsed walls and rusted gurneys, the faint sound of dripping water echoing through the halls. They found a small room with a heavy steel door and ducked inside, closing it behind them. Jenna slid to the floor, hugging her knees. "What do we do?" she whispered. Claire didn't answer. She was staring at the walls, which were covered in scratch marks. Words had been etched into the plaster, repeated over and over. "She deserved it." A metallic clatter echoed down the hall, and both women froze. The footsteps were back, slow and deliberate, growing louder with each passing second. Claire gripped a broken piece of pipe she'd found in the rubble, her hands trembling. The footsteps stopped outside the door. For a moment, there was silence. Then the door creaked open. The masked man stepped inside, his knife gleaming in the faint light. Claire screamed, swinging the pipe with all her strength. It connected with his shoulder, but he barely flinched. His head turned toward her, the blank mask tilting slightly. Jenna bolted, slipping past him and out the door. "Jenna! No!" Claire shouted, but it was too late. The man lunged after her, his knife glinting as he disappeared into the hall. Claire stood frozen, her heart pounding. The silence stretched on, broken only by the faint sound of footsteps growing distant. She didn't wait to find out what happened next. Gripping the pipe, she ran into the night, the sanitarium's shadows closing in behind her. The next morning, the local authorities found the campsite. Blood stained the ground, and 2 tents lay in tatters. They never found Claire or her friends. But deep in the forest, near the ruins of Woodward Sanitarium, campers swear they can still hear footsteps in the night. Lena and Mark's marriage had reached its breaking point. Seeking a fresh start, Mark suggested a weekend away at the family's remote lakeside cabin. Lena reluctantly agreed, unaware of her husband's true intentions. Mark had no desire to rekindle their love. He wanted closure, a dark and permanent kind. But what neither anticipated was that the cabin held secrets of its own, and their plans would pale in comparison to the horrors waiting for them. The drive was quiet, except for the faint hum of the car engine and the occasional sigh from Lena. She stared out of the window, watching the thick forest blur by. Mark tried to break the silence. "It'll be good for us, Lena," he said, gripping the steering wheel. She didn't respond, her mind lingering on the tension that had consumed their marriage. In the trunk lay a carefully packed rope and a hunting knife, concealed beneath a pile of blankets. Mark's resolve hardened. He had no choice but to free himself from her suffocating presence. He'd already lost too much in this marriage. Lena, however, was not as oblivious as he thought. She had her own plans. Tucked in her suitcase was a small vial of rat poison, meant to ensure Mark wouldn't leave this cabin alive. The cabin stood by the edge of a still lake, its wooden exterior weathered by years of harsh winters. Lena stepped out of the car and felt an unsettling chill, though the sun still hung in the sky. The surrounding forest was eerily quiet, not even the sound of birds chirping. "This place hasn't changed," Lena muttered, more to herself than to Mark. Mark carried their bags inside, noting the musty smell that lingered. Something about the air felt heavier than he remembered. As they unpacked, Lena froze. A faint, low whisper echoed through the cabin. "Did you hear that?" she asked. "Hear what?" Mark replied, feigning indifference. Lena shook her head and dismissed it, though her unease remained. Dinner was tense, each silently calculating their next move. Mark suggested a walk by the lake, but Lena refused, claiming exhaustion. She wanted to slip the poison into his morning coffee, and Mark planned to strike after she fell asleep. That night, as they lay in bed, Lena awoke to a creaking sound. She turned her head to see a shadow move across the far wall. "Mark?" she whispered, but he was sound asleep beside her. The shadow stopped, and for a moment she thought her mind was playing tricks on her. Then she heard it, a faint, chilling whisper. "Get out!" Lena shot up, her heart pounding. She shook Mark awake. "Someone's in the cabin," she hissed. Mark groggily grabbed a flashlight and checked every room, but the cabin was empty. Yet, as he walked back to bed, he felt a cold breath on his neck. By morning, the tension between them had escalated. Mark poured himself coffee, his hand brushing against the knife hidden in his jacket pocket. Lena sat across from him, her eyes darting to the poison vial concealed in her apron. "I didn't sleep well," Mark said, taking a sip. "Maybe this place isn't as peaceful as you remember," Lena replied, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Before Mark could respond, the room seemed to shift. The sunlight streaming through the windows dimmed, and the faint whispering grew louder. Both of them froze. "What is that?" Lena asked, her voice trembling. The whispering grew clearer, the words dripping with malice. "Leave. You don't belong here. Blood. Betrayal." Suddenly, the door slammed shut and the lights flickered. Mark grabbed Lena's arm, dragging her toward the front door, but it wouldn't budge. "Who's there?" Mark shouted into the empty cabin. The air grew colder, and a figure began to take shape, a woman in a tattered dress, her hollow eyes locked on them. "What do you want?" Lena cried, tears streaming down her face. The ghost tilted her head. "You're just like them, the last couple who thought they could betray each other here." Mark and Lena exchanged horrified glances as the ghost continued. "This place was my home. I loved, I trusted, and he killed me for money. Now I keep those like him, like you, from leaving." Mark felt the weight of his guilt crushing him. "It's her fault," he shouted, pointing at Lena. "She's been planning to kill me too." Lena gasped, her plan now exposed. "You hypocrite! You were going to kill me first!" The ghost laughed, a chilling, hollow sound. "Perfect. You've condemned yourselves." The ghost raised a hand, and the cabin's walls began to bleed, dark red streaks seeping down to the floor. The whispers turned into screams. Mark and Lena's survival instincts kicked in. Mark lunged for the knife in his jacket, while Lena reached for a chair to defend herself. But as they fought, the ghost whispered again. "You can't kill each other. You're mine now." The door suddenly opened, and the cold night air poured in. Seeing their chance, they bolted outside, only to find the forest distorted, the trees twisting unnaturally. The cabin loomed larger behind them, as if it were alive. Lena tripped, and Mark hesitated before helping her. Despite their hatred, they realized they needed each other to survive. Together, they ran toward the lake, hoping the water would break the ghost's hold. Reaching the lake, they jumped into a rowboat and began paddling furiously. The whispers faded as the cabin grew smaller in the distance. For a moment, it seemed they were safe. But as they reached the center of the lake, Lena froze. Mark looked at her in confusion. "What's wrong?" he asked. Lena's eyes filled with terror. "She's here." The water beneath them churned, and icy hands emerged, pulling the boat down. Their screams echoed through the night as the ghost's laughter filled the air. The lake grew still once more, and the cabin stood silent, waiting for its next visitors. A week later, a local fisherman found the couple's car abandoned by the cabin. No trace of Mark or Lena was ever discovered, but the whispers in the woods grew louder, warning those who dared come too close. The small town of Willowbrook was known for its quiet streets, where everyone knew each other, and secrets were few and far between. Emma, a young woman in her early 20s, had always loved the peacefulness of the town. She had recently returned to her childhood home after a difficult breakup, seeking comfort and solace from her parents, who still lived in the house she grew up in. Her life had been upended, and she needed time to heal. She didn't expect that the very peace she sought would soon turn into a nightmare. Her parents were kind and warm, always offering her a comforting presence. But something had changed since her return. The old house, where she had spent countless nights as a child, felt different, heavier, almost suffocating. Emma dismissed it at first as the result of the emotional turmoil she was experiencing, but there was an unsettling sense of unease that she couldn't shake. One evening, as Emma was sitting in the living room reading a book, the doorbell rang. It was strange. Her parents were away visiting relatives, and Emma hadn't been expecting anyone. She opened the door cautiously to find a man standing there. He was tall, dressed in a dark suit, his smile polite and warm. But there was something about his eyes, cold, calculating, that made Emma feel uneasy. "Good evening," the man said smoothly. "I'm Thomas. I'm new in town, and I've heard such good things about your family. I was wondering if you could help me with a few things around the house." Emma hesitated but smiled back politely, unsure what to make of him. "Sure, I can help. What's going on?" Thomas explained that he had recently moved into a nearby house and was trying to get it in order. He was a man of mystery, a quiet, reserved figure who seemed to be well liked in town, but never spoke much of his past. The more Emma talked to him, the more she felt a strange pull to his charm. He was always kind, attentive, and respectful, a man who exuded warmth and consideration. It wasn't long before he began to visit regularly, helping her with small tasks around the house. They talked about family, life, and the future, and slowly Emma started to trust him. But as days passed, Emma began to notice peculiar things. Every time Thomas visited, there was a strange tension in the air. The house seemed darker, the walls whispering in the silence. Sometimes she'd catch a fleeting shadow or hear footsteps when she was certain no one else was there. Each time she would dismiss it, blaming the strange events on her own imagination or the old house settling. One evening, after a long day, Emma came home from the market to find Thomas waiting on her doorstep. He was standing with an air of urgency, his usually calm demeanor now strained. "Emma," he said softly, almost too softly, "there's something you need to know about your family. Something dangerous. Something that has to do with this house. I didn't want to tell you, but you deserve the truth." Emma's heart raced. "What are you talking about?" Thomas's face turned grim, his eyes dark with something she couldn't place. "You don't know it yet, but you're in grave danger. This house, your family, it's cursed. I can help you, but we need to act quickly." Emma was taken aback. "Cursed? What are you talking about?" He leaned in closer, his voice lowering to a whisper. "Your family has been hiding secrets, dark secrets, secrets tied to an old curse, and your parents, they're not who they appear to be. I'm trying to protect you." Before Emma could respond, Thomas reached out, gently taking her hand. His touch was cold, and the chill from his hands spread up her arm. She pulled back instinctively, but something in his gaze held her. "You're not safe here," he said urgently. "You need to come with me. I can protect you." Emma felt a shiver run down her spine. "What do you mean, protect me?" She hesitated. "Why should I trust you?" Thomas's eyes darkened further, his face turning pale as he stepped closer, his grip tightening on her arm. "Because, Emma, your parents aren't who they say they are. They're part of something far darker than you can understand, and I'm the only one who can keep you safe." Fear gripped Emma as she took a step back, her heart pounding. "What are you talking about? You're scaring me." For a moment, Thomas stood motionless, his eyes narrowing as if trying to gauge her reaction. Then, suddenly, his demeanor shifted. His lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't the warm smile she had grown accustomed to. It was cold and calculating. "I wasn't lying to you, Emma," he said, his voice lowering to a whisper. "But I was never here to protect you. I'm here to take you." Before she could react, Thomas lunged, grabbing her by the wrist and pulling her toward his car. Emma screamed, struggling to break free, but his grip was too strong. She couldn't believe what was happening, her mind racing to understand what had gone wrong. The man who had seemed so kind, so genuine, was now revealing his true intentions. As Thomas dragged her toward the car, Emma caught a glimpse of her parents' house in the distance. The windows were dark, but she could have sworn she saw a shadow moving behind one of the curtains. Desperation surged through Emma. She kicked and screamed, thrashing against him, but he was relentless. He shoved her into the car, locking the doors behind him. The engine roared to life, and they sped off into the night. The further they drove, the more Emma realized just how deep the deception ran. Thomas wasn't just a stranger. He was someone who had carefully studied her family, and her every move. And now, as they drove deeper into the woods, Emma began to fear that she might never see her home again. The car finally came to a stop in front of an old, decrepit house deep in the forest. It was abandoned, surrounded by overgrown trees and vines. The air was thick with the scent of decay. "Where are we?" Emma gasped, her voice trembling with fear. Thomas's smile widened as he stepped out of the car. "This is where you'll be safe," he said, his tone sickeningly sweet. "This is where I'll keep you." But Emma, in her panic, had already seen enough. She couldn't fight him physically, but there was one thing she could do: use her mind. As he walked away to unlock the door, she noticed a phone on the ground, half buried under the leaves. With trembling hands, she grabbed it and dialed the one number she knew she could trust. "Hello?" Her father's voice crackled through the line. "Dad, help me," Emma whispered urgently. "I don't know who he is, but he's taking me somewhere. He's not who he says he is. He's dangerous. Please, I need you to come." Her father's voice was sharp with panic. "Stay calm, Emma. We're coming. Just hold on." Emma clutched the phone, barely able to breathe as she heard Thomas's footsteps drawing closer. She quickly hung up, not daring to make a sound. But just as Thomas reached the door, a loud crash rang out behind them. Thomas froze, looking over his shoulder with a mix of fear and confusion. The sound of tires screeching and headlights approaching filled the air. Emma's heart leaped in her chest. It was her father, and he wasn't alone. "Get in the house, now," Thomas barked, but before he could move, a shot rang out, followed by the loud thud of a body hitting the ground. Emma's father, with her mother at his side, emerged from the shadows, guns in hand. They rushed forward, securing Thomas in a matter of moments, his plan to kidnap her falling apart. Emma's parents were not who they seemed either. Not exactly. They were part of something much darker, something that even Emma had never known. The truth, however, would take her years to fully comprehend. As they drove back to town, Emma glanced out the window, her thoughts swirling. Whatever her parents had been hiding, whatever Thomas had been after, was far more sinister than she could ever imagine. But for now, she was safe. The blogger's curse. Tom Hardy was tired of feeling invisible. At 28, he was a struggling writer, posting his thoughts on a small blog that barely saw traffic. Every day he scrolled through successful bloggers' sites, admiring their clever posts, viral content, and lives of luxury. "I can do this," he muttered to himself, staring at his computer screen late one night. He had to. It was the only way to escape the life he hated. The idea that finally struck him was brilliant, or so he thought. It was simple. A ghost story. But not just any ghost story. He'd create something that seemed real, something that would pull at the heartstrings of his readers. He wanted to share a tale that intertwined love, mystery, and death, a haunting that would leave readers begging for more. Tom's inspiration came from an old forgotten house just outside of town. It was an eerie place, known only by word of mouth. People said it was cursed, but no one really knew why. It was the perfect setting for the love story he had in mind. Two souls bound together by death, separated by time, but yearning for reunion. He decided to take his girlfriend, Lucy, with him to the house. Lucy was his rock, his one support in a world full of failure. She didn't know about his secret desire to go viral, but she was always excited about his passion for writing. "You want to visit the old house? Are you sure?" She asked one evening as they sipped wine at their kitchen table. "I need a story, Lucy," he said with a smile, though a knot of uncertainty twisted in his stomach. "A real story. This could be it." With her hesitant agreement, they drove out to the house the following weekend. The sun had already set by the time they arrived, casting long, creepy shadows across the overgrown path that led to the house. Tom's heart raced as they approached the decaying structure, its windows dark like empty eyes staring out at them. There was something unsettling about the air, like the house was alive, watching them. Lucy shivered, but Tom just grinned. He was determined to get his story. Inside, the air was thick with dust. Old furniture was covered in white sheets, and the floorboards creaked under their feet. The only sound was the occasional flutter of a rat's tail skittering away. It was the kind of place that felt abandoned for decades, a relic of another time. Tom pulled out his phone and began recording, speaking into the camera as if the world was watching. "This is the old Davenport house, rumored to be haunted by the spirits of a couple who died tragically. Their love was so strong that even in death they couldn't part. Lucy wandered off into one of the rooms, her footsteps muffled by the layers of dust. She was already uneasy, her curiosity tempered by an instinctive fear. Tom barely noticed, so absorbed was he in his storytelling. The house seemed to hum with a strange energy. As Tom continued to narrate, a sudden cold breeze swept through the room. The lights flickered, and Tom stopped mid-sentence. He looked around, his heart thudding. "Lucy?" he called, his voice echoing. There was no answer. Panicking, he turned off the camera and went looking for her. He found her standing in a darkened corner of the house, her back to him. She was staring at something, her eyes wide, frozen in place. "Lucy? What's wrong?" he asked, rushing to her side. She didn't respond, just pointed a trembling finger at the far wall. There in the dim light was a painting. It depicted a woman in a white dress, her face a perfect blend of sadness and longing. But it wasn't just the painting that made Tom's blood run cold. It was the man beside her. He looked exactly like Tom, his face eerily familiar, his eyes locked in an eternal gaze with the woman. "That's me," Tom whispered, stepping closer to the painting. "How could?" Suddenly, the temperature dropped and a voice, soft and distant, whispered through the room. "Find her." Lucy's grip tightened on his arm. "Tom, we need to leave. This isn't right." But Tom couldn't move. His eyes were fixed on the painting, his mind racing. Find her. Who was this woman? Why did she look like she was waiting for him? Was this some twisted coincidence, or was it something more? A loud crash echoed through the house, followed by a long, drawn-out groan. The walls seemed to breathe as if they were alive, and Tom's heart pounded harder with every second. He turned to run, but the door slammed shut before he could reach it. Then there was a light, a soft glow, flickering in the distance. Tom's curiosity drove him forward despite Lucy's desperate pleas to escape. The light led him to a dusty old staircase that spiraled downward. He reached the bottom where the glow intensified, revealing a small room bathed in an otherworldly hue. In the center of the room, a faded photograph sat on a table, its edges curled with age. Tom's fingers trembled as he picked it up. It was a photo of the same woman in the painting, only this time she wasn't alone. Beside her stood a man, his face a perfect match for Tom's. "Find her. You must find her." The voice returned, clearer now, more urgent. Lucy was at the top of the stairs, her eyes wide with terror. "Tom, please, let's go!" Tom dropped the photo, but before he could turn to leave, he felt a cold hand grip his shoulder. Spinning around, he saw her, the woman from the painting. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, and her mouth moved in silent words. She reached out to him, her fingers ghostly and translucent. Tom stepped back, his breath catching in his throat. "Who are you? What do you want from me?" The woman's lips parted, but instead of a voice, there was a rush of cold air, and Tom felt a weight press down on his chest. His vision blurred as he struggled to breathe. It was as though the house itself was alive, wrapping its fingers around his very soul. "Find her. You are the one." Suddenly, a flash of light erupted in front of him, and Tom felt himself fall backward, gasping for air. Lucy was beside him, her face pale, eyes wide with fear. Tom, we need to go. Now!" she cried, pulling him to his feet. But when Tom tried to stand, he realized something was wrong. His legs wouldn't move. His body felt numb, frozen in place. He could feel the presence of something dark and ancient moving around him, circling him like a predator. "You need to stay," the voice echoed, now louder, more insistent. Tom's phone vibrated in his pocket, and he fumbled to pull it out. A notification appeared on the screen. "Your latest post has gone viral." He glanced at Lucy, his eyes wide with panic. The story he had written, the ghost story, the viral content, had become something far more real than he had ever imagined. And then he understood. The woman in the painting, the man beside her, he was the man in the painting. He had written himself into a story that was never meant to be told. In the next moment, the house seemed to swallow him whole, darkness closing in as Lucy screamed in terror. The curse had already claimed him. Weeks later, Lucy returned to the house, hoping to find answers. But when she stepped inside, the air was still. Everything was as it had been. Dust-covered furniture, flickering lights, but Tom was gone. Only a new painting on the wall remained, a woman in a white dress, gazing longingly at a man beside her. His face was hers now. Tom had become the ghost, trapped in the very story he had created. and the legend of the blogger's curse lived on.